Everybody. Hello, good evening and welcome. I'm David Colburn with the Bob Graham Center, and we're really pleased to have you here this evening. Tonight we want to thank WUFT-FM and the Florida Public Radio Emergency Network for joining us and co-sponsoring the talk this evening. We ask you to turn off your cell phones if you would. After Mr. Fugate has spoken, we'll have this mic available for you to come up and ask questions. We would like our students to have first access, but the rest of you are more than welcome to come up and ask questions. We have to introduce Craig Fugate, Jeff Huffman, who is a meteorologist with WRUF-TV, and you may well remember Jeff during our recent hurricane battles. So, Jeff, you want to come on out and introduce Craig?
So, welcome everyone, and I'm not really used to introducing folks, and he told me to keep it short, so I'll keep it as short as I can. But if you don't know Craig, you must not be a Gainesville native, or maybe a Alachua County resident who needed a fire extinguished in the 1980s. You might not have lived in Florida. There are Charlie, Francis, Jean, Ivan, Dennis, Katrina, and Wilma. He was the man who helped our state recover from all 7 of those hurricanes in a span of 2 years as the director of the State Emergency Management, or State Emergency Response Team. And under the appointment of President Barack Obama as FEMA administrator, if you didn't know Craig, you must have not been a survivor of an unprecedented 168 federally declared disasters in the 2 years, from 2010 to 2011. I almost forgot to mention that you mentioned it. If you don't know Craig, you might not have been watching our Hurricane Irma coverage. He was so gracious to stop by and help us with that through the Florida Public Radio Emergency Network. And if by now you don't know Craig, you have the opportunity. He currently serves as a senior advisor at Blue Dot Strategies, assisting clients with emergency management implementation. And without further delay, I want to introduce you to Mr. Craig Fugate.
Hi, I'm Craig. I feel like I'm at a meeting, and I got feedback from that, so I'm standing here a little bit. I am Craig. I am a disaster survivor. Although losing your power for a couple of days and having a tree leaning near your house but not hitting it, I don't really think qualifies. But it was something funny. I was talking to Governor Bush a couple of days after Irma. He said, "Well, how are you doing?" I said, "The power's still out." He said, "Yeah, it's still out here in the Gables." And I said, "Yeah, it's kind of interesting. That's the first time that we actually were in that role. Normally, we're on the other side, and now we're basically the same ones going, so when's are you going to get the power back out?" Soon, they keep telling me. I found that if you tweet them, it's actually faster. But I want to kind of talk about this. This was actually scheduled before all the hurricanes. And I've been at FEMA, and I've done the state, and I worked here in Alachua County. And my primary focus has always been on how do you respond more effectively to disasters. And you start realizing that there is a theoretical point where just responding better isn't good enough. You're seeing this play out in Puerto Rico, and right now everybody's wanting to be the experts and say how everybody's all messed up. I got bad news for you. That's what it is. When you hit areas that big, you take out that much infrastructure, the first priority is just trying to keep people alive. And it's not going to be a pretty response, and it's not going to be what you're used to seeing, because you can't drive to Puerto Rico. Just like you can't drive to Alaska, Hawaii, the Virgin Islands, Guam, Commonwealth and the Northern Mariana Islands, or American Samoa. And I've dealt with disasters in all those areas. So there's a lot of challenges that happen with these things. But even that started me asking the question, why do we have to keep responding to bigger and more complex disasters? And we seem to be putting a lot of emphasis on how to respond. We never really talk about why we're having to respond. And so that was really the whole gist of this conversation. And then we had 3 hurricanes. So it's even more salient. So a couple of things on vocabulary. I'm a big person, I'm big about words. I think words matter. So some of the things that I learned when I brought the FEMA I brought there was, I don't call people disaster victims. I call them survivors. And part of that is a recognition that our job is to support them, not come in and tell them how to do stuff. And the bigger the disaster, the faster the response is going to be, not from me, not from people with lights and sirens, but from your neighbor. And we have really, I think, done a disservice in our country of really marginalizing the public role in disaster response. When time and time again, you'll see that neighbors helping neighbors is the fastest response. You saw the Cajun Navy, both in the floods last year and this year, just spontaneous, no organization, not trained, kind of scary government going, whoa, wait a minute, who are you people and why are you here? Joplin, we were with President Obama, we were in the neighborhood, we're talking to this man, he's standing on the front porch of his house. That is all that is left. The President asked him, he was there dinner for I said, yes, sir. And he said, well, can you tell me what happened? He said, well, I was making a sandwich and the sirens have been going off, but they've been going off all day. And, we already had a couple come through, but they had missed. And it goes off again, I looked out, and I couldn't figure out why I couldn't see the hospital. There was a cloud in the way, and then I realized it was a tornado, so I dove in my closet and hid. And then everything came ripping apart, and the president said, were you okay? I said, yeah, I was fine. My house was gone, but I was fine. Well, what did you do? The guy kind of looked at the president like, well, I went and started helping my neighbors. The president said, sir, you mind if I ask you how old you are? I said, no, I'm 78. That was not an isolated story. If you talk to most of the people in Joplin, who got to them first, who pulled them out of the debris, it was a neighbor or a bystander. And it constantly amazes me how, when we talk about planning and response, we always talk about what the government's going to do, and we never recognize the the public. So part of this is, call them survivors. They survived it, they're closest to it, and they need to be part of the team. The victims are the ones we lost, and we're gonna mourn and bury. But the survivors, they need to be part of that team. The second thing is, and I learned this from a famous researcher, Dr. Dennis Melendi. He wrote a book, Disasters by Design. We commonly refer to all these things as natural disasters. And that's actually kind of an excuse. It's an act of God. God never told you to build there the way you built, so why are you blaming him? Hurricanes were happening well before we settled here. Disasters are by design. It's just a disaster. There are natural hazards we face. Florida faces more than its fair share. Fortunately, we don't have big risk from volcanoes and tsunamis, but just about everything else we have to face one time or the other. We go through drought cycles that produce tremendous wildfires. That's not unexpected. That's actually part of our history and the ecology we live in. Yet, where do we like to build our houses? In the woods. And then we get all upset when they burn down the house. Well, what happens when you put combustible materials in the woods during a drought with wildfires? And this is a mystery? And then everybody expects, well, why couldn't they put my house out? Well, you and the other 300, we don't have that many fire trucks. So disasters are disasters. There's nothing natural about it. We have natural hazards. They only become disasters how and where we build. And this isn't about not building, but do we really need to be putting plastic soffits in homes in the interface area because they're cheap? You know what happens when you have plastic soffits in a wildfire? They melt. When they melt, guess what? You have a hole leading into your roof. You know what happens when an ember gets up there? Your house burns down. Now think about our building codes allowing plastic soffits because it's cheap. How much does a wire one cost? A couple of dimes more? And yet, in many cases, going neighborhood by neighborhood, that is the difference between a home that stands and the slab next to it. It's how we build, where we build, that makes things disasters. And this was really what I wanted to talk about. Why are disasters getting bigger? Is it climate disruption and climate change? Well, the hazards are getting more intense, just from the standpoint of, if you looked at the number of rainfall events exceeding a 100-year event. When I got to FEMA, 100-year events meant every couple of weeks. 500-year events were every couple of months. They were running into new scales of thousands plus. Think about Houston. They've had 500-year events in the last 10 years 3 times. And when you look back in our history, we cannot find this many extreme rainfall events of this concentration all across the country. Year before 2015, it was South Carolina. Last year, it was Louisiana. Neither one of those were tropical systems. They were tropical moisture, but they weren't tropical systems. Louisiana, most people don't realize how bad the floods there last year were. People know about Matthew because it grazed us. But Louisiana floods kind of got lost between the Olympics and the election. But let me give you the scale of how bad it was. In Hurricane Sandy, across New Jersey and New York, we run our what we call individual assistance program. It's a grant program to provide people temporary assistance for uninsured losses. It helps them with getting a place to stay. And it's really not designed to make people whole. It's really just to help them get started. 32 days after Sandy, we exceeded $1 billion in payments. In Louisiana, we hit that number in 30 days. Now think about the difference in population density that Sandy hit, and the fact we got to $1 billion in Louisiana that quick on a flood that was not tropical in nature. Those are the kind of events we're seeing more frequently. So we are increasing the number of events that we're seeing. The cycle between events is increasing. We were supposed to be in an El Nino year. How many people saw the seasonal forecast at the beginning of the year? What was it supposed to be? Below average. But like any good bookies, they're always adjusting their point spread as they get closer to the game. So they started changing that a little closer when they realized there was not going to be an El Nino, which traditionally suppresses storms, because we were in the condition that's the most, to me, serious time in Florida is what we call La Nada, is neutral conditions. You know the last time we had neutral conditions? 2004. Kind of why I get nervous when you go to neutral conditions. But I don't really pay attention to seasonal forecasts. There's a quick story on this. I was in a briefing with the NOAA administrator, 2010. We're in the sitting room. We all had our allocations of briefings and our PowerPoints, and everything was vetted, and everything you're supposed to say is rehearsed, and it's pretty boring. And the NOAA administrator kept going on and on about the seasonal forecast, how in 2010 it was going to be off the scale, worst we've ever seen. Everything was going to be, destroyed. And the president, actually, they used up all the time. So I didn't have to do my slides, which was cool with me. The president says, Craig, yes, sir. What are you going to do different? I said, nothing. President Obama took about 1 second to go, yeah, right, we get ready for hurricane season no matter what the seasonal forecast is. I said, yes, sir. Until they tell me there ain't going to be hurricanes, we get ready. I'd be like, good meeting, I'm done. So 29 minutes of the world's going on, and 1 minute I'm going, you get ready for hurricane season. That was the brief. But we're seeing this frequency of events occur. We're seeing it go back and forth. And it's not just us. I've been in New Zealand and Australia this summer. And my counterparts down there are dealing with a scale of events they've never seen before. New Zealand. You know about the earthquakes. Well, did you know that Christchurch last year had such a severe drought, they were having wildfires and losing hundreds of homes around Christchurch on the South Island? And then approximately 3 weeks later, they got hit with 2 post-tropical cyclones and flooded in areas that they'd never flooded before. And the Maori people, the indigenous people, said there is no record in our oral history of these events occurring this frequently. Australia, you think of Australia always drought and wildfires? Their big problem is flooding. And on a scale they've never dealt with. And again, going back to the Aborigines who have an oral history going back that far, they're saying, we don't see, there's no history of this. Yeah, we have singular events, but not back to back. So we seem to be getting more natural hazards and frequencies and durations and intensities that don't really resonate with our past history. And we're increasingly putting more value, risk, and infrastructure in these areas, and we're not really building them for the changing profiles we're seeing. The traditional thing we do is we look at the last 100 years of weather data to determine what the likely types of impacts are, and then we'll calculate that into what we should build to. So think about it. We're in a changing environment. The science is there. You can tell me you don't believe in stuff. I'm like, well, I don't believe in climate change either. That's not a belief system. That's factual because you can prove and disprove climate change. And whether I believe in God or not, it's hard to prove or disprove. That's a belief system. But climate change is factual. There's data there, and if you can prove people wrong, have a nice try. But your belief systems don't really matter to me. I don't believe in climate change. It's factual. It's happening. What is hard to figure out, though, is how do you tie that to singular events, which is not something that you should be doing and saying a hurricane is caused by climate change. What you really want to look at is frequency, duration, and intensity, and is that changing? I don't believe in climate change. I don't really care. Every one of the hurricanes this year broke records. Think about that. Harvey broke records, Irma broke records, Marie broke records. How is looking at past data going to help me if the 3 hurricanes that hit this year all broke records? Yet, if you go to the federal plan for rebuilding, we're going to build back to past data. In fact, the administration rolled back one of the Obama initiatives, which was to take our limited knowledge about what is changing and basically say, because this is me, I'm like, man, let's just double it. Because we don't know. So we actually doubled the flood standards in the Obama administration for any federally funded projects, both new construction and rebuilding, not just limited to disaster dollars, but also tied into HUD, transportation, Corps of Engineers. And what that basically means is your current standard is we measure, and again, the maps aren't perfect, but we calculate out what the 100-year flood risk is. And we get an elevation. And then we say you want to build 1 foot above that to minimize your flood risk. And that works pretty good as long as you're having 100-year flood events. But if every hurricane this year is breaking the records on rainfall and intensity, it isn't going to work. Our recommendation was double it, go to 2 feet. This is how much we were talking about in construction. 12 inches. And they said, this is a burdensome, costly regulatory overreach of the administration. We're going to roll it back. Probably because we used the word climate in there, and that was what got them all messed up. And we also said, you know, for certain facilities, we probably want to build in some additional protection, so let's build them at 3 feet, like a fire station, that you would prefer not to flood because you want it around to respond right after something happens. And so we said 2 feet for the community centers, 3 feet for critical infrastructure. And that got rolled back. So the current standard is going to be whatever we build back right now is going to be 1 foot above base flood elevation, and almost every one of these storms, we exceeded that and it flooded. So, disasters, both in cost and frequency, have been increasing. It isn't just that climate's changed, it's that we're building in more places and increasing populations on hazards that we really haven't thought about how we're building and what we could do to mitigate that. We have tremendous pressures because the people that build and develop are dealing with transactional risk. They make their money at the transaction. How much time does the average builder have an exposure to the long-term risk profiles they're building in? Weeks to months, right? And then they do their transaction, they make money. Who else makes money on that transaction? Banks. Why do banks want to refinance? Because they don't make as much money on interest anymore. They make money on transactions of refi. Who else makes money on transactions? Realtors. But Commissioner Reed will tell you, when you look at tax base, almost any government has not yet figured out in Florida how to grow the tax base without building new houses. So for a county or city to say we're not issuing building permits is actually suicidal to their taxes. Because they can only do one of two things: go to the top millage rate or add more properties to pay, because they haven't figured out how to grow economies yet without building houses. That's the fact in Florida. We're stuck in a do loop of, if we're not growing, we can't keep up with expenses. And if you want to keep your millage rates bearable, you got to add, because we haven't figured out how to increase the intrinsic value of property to keep from having to just develop. And guess who else makes money off of it? State of Florida. State of Florida, again, we don't have an income tax, right? We're very proud of it. It's in our Constitution. Hell, that's why I came home. But how does the state generate revenue?
Sales tax.
Sales tax, dock stamps, and transactions. So you have an economy, here in Florida particularly, built on the transaction of building and selling property. And the exposure to risk is very minimal until you actually buy something. Then that risk is now assumed by that owner. And I like to think of risk like energy. Once created, you can't hardly destroy it. It just keeps getting transferred. But all of the other systems are making their money on the front end till you end up owning the risk. Now, we'd like to think that was the homeowner with insurance, and if that was so, it would actually price risk to what people could afford. Because insurance should be priced at the point where if I'm not building the right way and the right risk, the market should control that by charging higher insurance rates. And if you can't afford the insurance, you change how and where you're building. But not in Florida. What do we have? We have an insurance commissioner who works for the governor, an elected official, whose job is to keep insurance, quote unquote, affordable. Well, that's a nice concept until you understand that keeping it affordable means we're not pricing risk to what it really costs. So there's no incentive to change behavior. And what you have found is we have set the price of risk so low that we continue to grow in unsustainable ways. And then we have my favorite program when I was at FEMA, the National Flood Insurance Program. When the insurance industry essentially walked away from the insurance market for flood, the federal government stepped in the 60s. They had very noble goals. which was to provide insurance to people who could not otherwise get insurance, protecting their mortgages and their homes, but then require communities to adopt codes and ordinances that would restrict growth in flood areas and to promote growth away from those areas, minimizing risk. Very laudable goals, but in any bureaucracy, the devil's in the details, and what we ended up creating was a program that miscommunicates risk, grew it, and sustains and supports development in high hazard areas beyond which would never had occurred if we weren't running the flood insurance program. And here's how that works. You ever heard the term flood zone? Most people think if I live in a flood zone, I flood. If I don't live in a flood zone, I don't flood. That's the first thing we got wrong in the bureaucracy. We were trying to delineate the higher risk properties that Congress said would be mandatory purchase requirements if you had a federal mortgage. You had to buy flood insurance to protect the mortgage. It never said you didn't flood outside of that. That was just the threshold of when you had to buy it. We've been better off just saying everybody's got to buy it. Of course, then the people that live on top of the mountains will go, it's bureaucracy, overreach, and red tape. But the minute you try to delineate where people have to buy it versus where they should buy it, what people heard is, I'm in a flood zone, I'm not in the flood zone. Did you see how many people in Houston flooded that weren't in the flood zone? Kind of shows you how programs like that, the intention were noble, but we have created a mess. And what has happened now is we have a program that's $25 million in debt before Harvard. They're going to have to borrow money. They're going to probably end up around $35+ billion in debt that you're loaning the money to the program, and they're not going to pay it back. It is, Congressional Budget Office came out and said that the inland residents are subsidizing the coastal residents, and that 25% of all policies are below what the actual rates should have been because they were grandfathered in. And it keeps growing. It's not going to be easy to fix. My first suggestion to Congress was, I think we have an obligation to people that already have homes in flood zones that are at risk. We got to figure out how we manage that. And if we try to price that to what the market values are, we're going to force people out of their homes. I don't think that's good policy. I think we have to take a step back and go, we got what we got. It's going to take a while to figure that out, but we should not be yanking the rug out from people who did nothing wrong but buy a house that was in a flood zone. But I do think we should stop the insanity and quit growing the program. So my recommendations, which are actually being taken up in the House by Financial Committee, the chairman, was stop writing policies on new construction. If it hasn't been built, let the private sector insure it. Kind of the answer is, hey, if the private sector isn't going to insure your property out there in the coastal flats, why should the taxpayer? Now, this isn't about taking away property development rights or anybody's ability to build. It just says let the private sector price risk and manage the risk. Guess who came out in opposition, spiked the ball, and killed it? Realtors. And they actually put out on their website their position papers on that. I love going to those sites and tweeting, here's who's blocking you from getting out of subsidizing new growth. Why? They make money on transactions. Now, that isn't the blanket all realtors. And actually, there's a lot of realtors within their own profession that are kind of aghast they took the position in the first place. But as a national organization, they took the position. Just like Florida Home Builders took the position that the Florida Building Code was too tough. That we probably went overboard after the 04-05 hurricane season, and updating the code every 3 years is an unnecessary, burdensome regulatory overreach, making homes unaffordable. So we think we should just review the updates every 3 years, and if we think they're relevant, we'll adopt them. Of course, since they have a preponderance of representation on the Florida Building Code Commission, what do you think the chances of that happening are? So we have, both through things like the flood insurance program, and then this other thing, the disaster programs, the ones everybody started hearing. Alachua County got declared. Baffled me. I was FEMA minister. We'd never declared Alachua County. I live here. It wasn't that bad. But there's this tendency that for local governments and state governments, their big risk would be if all of these properties got hit and destroyed, how are they going to rebuild and recover? Well, fortunately, we have FEMA and the disaster assistance programs. administered by us, where the governor certifies to the president that it's exceeded all the capabilities of the state, and that the state could not possibly recover without the support of the federal government. Most of the time, that's a grant writing exercise or writing checks. And here's what most people don't know. Do you know what FEMA pays for? The only thing FEMA pays for is uninsured losses. We do not pay for things that are insured. Now, it makes absolute sense to pay for shelter operations, calling out the National Guard, even picking up debris and other things. Those are response costs. But that's not where the big dollars are. When Sandy hit, you paid for 9 hospitals. You know why? Because they were either nonprofits or government-based, uninsured, who suffered billions of dollars of losses. If that had been the Hospital Corporation of America or any other investor-owned hospital, you know how much money they'd have gotten from FEMA? 0. You as a taxpayer do not underwrite the private sector's risk. They manage it themselves. But if it's a nonprofit, eligible, or a government entity, and they choose not to carry insurance because they figure if it's really bad, you get a declaration, you write the risk. Local governments are just as guilty. There is a growing trend back in the 70s when workman's comp became unaffordable, that local governments became self-insured because it actually made more sense to pay out workers' comp claims out of pocket and administer ourselves than what the exorbitant rates were. But it started a trend that said, hey, if we're going to do our own workers' comp, why don't we do other things? And so we started seeing that the business decision was made, we'll go self-insurance. Because if we lose a building here or there, it's still more effective than paying out insurance every year. But if it's really, really bad, it's probably a disaster, and we're going to get 75 cents on the dollar from the federal government. How could we lose? So what you also have is local and state governments have transferred a whole lot of their risk to you, the taxpayer, to underwrite their risk because the thresholds for disaster declarations are so low that there's no real incentive to change behavior. So we have a flood insurance program that's subsidizing risk. It's not going to change behavior, and when you try to change it, you got too many people with vested interest fighting it and will get it killed and spike it on the hill. You have disaster assistance programs that have a place and should be there when it is really exceeding the capabilities, but so many times it's really a grant writing exercise of transferred risk to the federal taxpayer paying for it. Again, what do we pay for? Uninsured losses. If you take all the debris and all the response costs and you looked at that pie and then you look at everything else is a lot bigger. And that's all uninsured losses. Now think about this. What's the incentive for local and state governments to really talk about how do you build based upon risk profiles and change behavior and spend more money on the front end? As long as they got a subsidized system you're underwriting that you really have no say in, that's growing risk that's not sustainable. And then we always beat the system up on why we can't respond faster. Like in Louisiana. Why couldn't you suddenly produce 75,000 housing units? Are you kidding me? Why did you build homes that means we're going to have 75,000 homes get flooded in the first place? I mean, people were behind levee systems and going, well, I'm not in a flood zone. What do you think that is? You're in a flood zone, you got a levee. You just get a cheaper rate. And the thing is that kills me is if they had been buying flood insurance, they had been buying a preferred rate. You know what preferred rate is for a value of $250,000 insurance for $100,000 of content? About $350 to $400. But people weren't buying it because I'm not in a flood zone. No, you're in a floodable area. You just weren't in a mandatory purchase. So you wrote a check for $1 billion that will not help these people recover. That's just to start the response and the immediate recovery issues. Governor John Bell Edwards had to go back to Congress and get a supplemental for $500 million. And they're literally giving grants to people for up to $150,000 to make repairs to their homes. That's your taxpayers' dollars. Going back, that if they had bought that $300 to $400 insurance policy, A, they would have been waiting for Congress to do a supplemental, and B, they'd already be back in their homes. But we have been moving risk to subsidies in a way that isn't sustainable, in an era of changing profiles that constantly always looks backwards to determine risk. And we're growing disasters bigger and faster than we can ever possibly credibly respond to them. Whether it's earthquakes, whether it's weather-related, whether it's tech hazards. Well, of course, I'm kind of an atheist when it comes to cybersecurity. Everybody says, well, I'm worried about lights going out. I'm like, I got bad news for you. The squirrels have still knocked out more power than the first successful cyber attack. Don't believe me? Go look. There's a website, cybersquirrel.com. They actually have a Twitter handle too, and they track all the animal-related outages that are caused in outside of hurricanes. The leading cause of most power outages is not cyber attacks; it's vermin, and generally squirrels. Although occasionally we have the raccoons or some other wildlife. And so my thought was, if we have all these squirrels who, I mean, they run across power lines all the time, right? So the ones who get electrocuted must have done it intentionally. So I'm thinking, maybe instead of worrying about cyber as much as we do, we ought to be putting Prozac in the water supply for the squirrels. If everyone is depressed, maybe they wouldn't be shorting out as much. But it's not to say that cyber is not a problem. It's just most people look at it from very simplistic things like the power's going to go out. You want to worry about cyber? Worry about financial security and transaction. Worry about communication systems. Worry about what happens when you go to your checking account and it's reading zeros, and your ATM isn't working, and it's not just a bank error that day. That's a real risk from cyber. Power goes out, we deal with that a lot. The fact that somebody thinks you can turn all the power off with some magical switch, we couldn't find it. We looked. You know why? There's this thing called geomagnetic storms, and when you get something on the scale of G5, the way you protect the grid is you shut it off. There's no switch to shut it off. If there was, we would have found it, because we had everybody sitting down in industry going, how do you turn the grid off when we get maybe a 12 to 18-hour window from the Space Weather Prediction Center that the polarization and strength of storm is going to take the grid out, and we're looking at a Clarington-style event, and we got to shut things down. And they're going, well, there's no switch. We all have to independently try to shut down and secure the grid without blowing each other up. So when they told me that, and everybody keeps telling me, you know, I interviewed Ted Koppel, and he's really worried about this. I'm like, I actually tried to find a hacker that could do it and then enlist them in case we do have a Clarington event so we could save the damn transformers. That's some of the stuff I deal with when I was at Washington. Is people worry about stuff. I'm like, the stuff you should be worrying about ain't that, or what you're worrying about isn't really what's going on. But what's really going on with disasters? Yeah, they're getting bigger and more frequent, but it's because we're building in ways that aren't sustainable, because we're pricing risk so low, we're not changing behavior. And there's two good examples of how we have changed behavior and culture in this country on risk. Seatbelts and cigarettes. When I grew up, you didn't wear seatbelts and you smoked. And if you did, you were the outlier. I mean, think about it. When I was a kid, if you didn't smoke, you were the one that was the outlier. You either had chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or there's something wrong with you. And I grew tobacco. I cropped tobacco. I didn't smoke. I was an outlier. But seatbelts were the same thing. I used to teach defensive driving. You know how many excuses I've learned from people about why they didn't wear seatbelts? They wanted to be thrown clear of the vehicle so they wouldn't get crushed. You do realize your chance of serious head trauma and cervical injuries is like off the scale, and you're probably going to die. Yeah, I just don't want to be trapped in the car if it's on fire. If I get thrown out and rolled over and break my neck and die, that's much better than the trauma of being stuck in my car with a seatbelt as it catches on fire. I'm like, do you know how many times a car's caught on fire with a seatbelt that didn't work and people couldn't get out? I can measure that with my pinky finger. But people do things that were kind of strange. But over time, we started changing that. Why? One was constant, consistent messaging, and two was enforcement. You started getting tickets. We started with the kids. You drive around with a kid that's not in a car seat, not only are the cops looking for you, everybody else is going to rat on you. They'll start calling you and say, hey, there's a person with a kid, they're not in a car seat, you need to stop them. When I was growing up, the back of the truck was good enough for me. But think about how things have changed in a relatively short period of time. We've gone from seatbelts were something that weren't available or was an option you paid for to People now, you're an outlier if you don't wear your seatbelt. It's almost unnatural to get in the car and not put the seatbelt on. Cigarettes, you're a pariah in today's society. You don't get to smoke inside. You got to stand out in the damn weather and smoke, right? Used to be the people that didn't smoke had to stand out in the weather. You can't smoke in restaurants, except in North Carolina. You can even smoke in hospitals in North Carolina. That's North Carolina. But in most places, you're so restricted on what you can do, and the price of cigarettes is priced so high. We've actually seen significant decreases in lung cancer, lung-related diseases, heart disease, which for all of us is actually saving every one of us money for fewer patients, putting demands on the health resource systems. Same thing with seatbelts. Fewer casualties. There's more people driving more miles, and our death rate has not kept up. It was because of increased safety. Yet even though we drive more miles, have more cars on the road, and we should have saw more deaths, it actually plateaued. So we know that if we address our risk, price it appropriately, we can change behaviors and change outcomes. Well, we need to take the same steps and start talking about disasters. Because our past is not a good indicator of our future. And when you have 3 hurricanes back to back, and all 3 of them are setting records, and you're telling me we're going to look at past data to figure out how we're going to build the future, I'm like, what part of this aren't you getting? And the best argument, and I think the administration is actually going to act on this, you don't have to talk about climate change, but doesn't it make sense if you're going to use your taxpayer dollars to build something back that wasn't insured, we're not going to just build it back the way it was to get wiped out next time, but put some investment in it and build it back better so it likely survives? That's actually good financial planning. That's a good use of federal dollars. That's a smart investment. So just don't use the word climate change. Maybe we'll do it. The last thing I want to leave you with, and I'm going to open up the questions, is when I got to Washington, I came across a profound observation. Wasn't that profound? Again, I'm kind of a simple person, but did you ever really wonder how bureaucracies can become just as mind-numbingly caught up in process and red tape, and just how it doesn't make any sense to people, and like, what were you thinking up there? But I know people in government, they're public servants. We call them bureaucrats as a negative, but they're public servants, they're good people, they're smart people, they're trying to do the right thing. How can a collection of some of the brightest people that we have try to do the right thing, come up with such strange and bizarre outcomes? Do you know how bureaucracies work? You tend to get a program requirement that Congress says, go do something and figure it out. Everybody hates all the rules that we make, and Congress says you shouldn't be making all these rules. They're the ones that mandate it. They give us a program that says, now write rules to administrate. So bureaucracies generally have to solve for complex problems that have to fit across a wide range of situations, some of which can never be anticipated, with the least amount of risk of failure or fraud or abuse, with the lowest efficiency or the greatest efficiency and the lowest expenditure of funds, to be able to reproduce it and do it over a scale of the entire country. So bureaucracies tend to solve for what they can manage with the least risk of failure and the greatest amount of outcome with the available resources they have. So they tend to build very tightly coupled systems around what's easy for them to administer. They don't intentionally split it out to make your life miserable. They're just trying to survive theirs and implement programs that won't result in them getting hauled off before committee hearings about everything that went wrong with it. So they tend to design for themselves what they can administer and get great success with the least amount of risk. That means that if you're one of the 80% that fit their programs, it's a great program. If you're an outlier, it ain't going to work. And if that was just one program, you can navigate it. But every program tends to default back to that same approach. When I got to FEMA, our individual assistance program, the one that helps the families that don't have insurance in declared situations, there was 9 different programs administered within that, all running separately. That when somebody came into FEMA, all 9 of them would ask for the same information. People go, why don't you guys talk? No, the programs were separate. They'd actually go out and hire contractors to build their systems for their program, never thinking it had to link to anything else. And I said, guys, you ever hear of Steve Jobs? Oh, yeah. I said, you ever see an iPhone? Well, yeah. How much instructions does an iPhone come with? None. I'm like, I want you to think like Apple. People shouldn't have to know us and read our rules and follow our instructions. We should build our systems around the people we serve. They shouldn't require instructions. Think about it. If you're applying for FEMA for assistance, it ain't a good day. First of all, you didn't have insurance, so you're financially in trouble already. You probably have lost things that you can never replace, and you may have lost loved ones. And now you're coming into the bureaucracy that says we're here to help. Call 1-800-621-FEMA. It's tattooed on our bodies. You know, or go to disasterassistance.gov, and we're going to solve all your problems. No, we're going to be the start of all your problems. Because when you get there, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to want all this information. Because we got to verify you are who you are, where you live, and you don't have insurance. Because you'd be surprised how many people will rip off the federal government and commit fraud. So you got to build systems that, well, of course I live here. Well, how do I know that? Well, what I need, can you send me a bill? That all got flooded. Well, what about your driver's license? I don't have one. It was I got pulled out in my pajamas. I don't have anything. Well, you don't have a bill. You can't prove who you are. We don't know who you are. Tell you what, when you get some documents, call us back. And then if you did get the documents and call us back, and I need a place to stay. Okay, great. We're going to give you to our TSA. Well, what do I need TSA? I'm not going through screening. Oh, no. We're the Transitional Shelter Assistance Team. Can't use acronyms that nobody else uses. We just copy each other. All right. So what I do, well, you call this number, and they'll set you up. So they call the number. Okay. Who are you? I'm so-and-so. Do you have your case number? Well, what's my case number? Well, if you register FEMA, you should have a case number. They didn't give you your case number? No. We'll call them back and get the case number and call us back. You're FEMA. Why can't you get the case number? Well, that's a separate program. We don't have any relationship with them. So then it's like, okay, who are you? What's your information? What's your proof of residency? What's your need? How many members are your family? Well, how do I know how many people you got in your family? Well, I'm telling you. Well, are they all members of the family, or are they other people? Do you have any boarders living with you? What's that got to do? I just want a place to stay. Well, we have to ask all these questions to make sure we're not providing assistance to people that aren't eligible. Oh, by the way, are you a U.S. citizen? Can you prove it? Because we can't give money to undocumented folks. That's one of the things Congress is pretty serious about. Don't help the undocumented. That would be unchristian-like. They better pray to God he doesn't come back, because he ain't going to be happy. But then you go, okay, I got a temporary place to stay, but my house is wrecked. I don't have insurance. And I'm going to have to figure out where I'm going to live for the next couple of years. Oh, we have temporary housing units. Well, how do I get that? Well, you got to call this number. And now you got to start the whole process over again. I'm like, guys, why do we do this? Because we built each one of these programs as standalones. We optimize them for the people running them with no consideration that it's just one family. They're dealing with as many as 9 different programs in FEMA to get help. So I said, I got a novel idea. Let's pretend we're Apple and they don't need instructions. And wherever they touch the system, they get help. And we figure out how to share information. And oh, by the way, you know, we can actually get credit bureaus and pay them. So when somebody says they're so-and-so, we can actually run a credit history and go, yep, they lived there, they got bills, we validated their information. That's how your bank does it. That's how anybody else does it. You're applying for assistance, we go and get the information. We can do that very quickly. And Sandy, now you go from Katrina, where our fraud and error rate was up to 15%. You get to Sandy, we did this on phone calls, using remote sensing. Basically, we had Civil Air Patrol fly over, take pictures of all the homes. Everybody says use drones. I'm like, actually, CAP's cheaper. And we could actually look up. You give us an address, we pull up your credit history and go, the name matches, the address matches. We look at the satellite imagery or the pictures from the CAP going, that home's got flooded. We're going to give you partial payment. That's how we got $1 billion out the door in 32 days. You know what our error rate in that process was? It jumped all the way up to 2.5%. SNAP, or what most people call food stamps, average error rate is 5 to 7% on a good day, just normal operation. In a crisis, we were only running at 2.5%. We still got yelled at. But it was this idea that We have to build our systems around the people we serve, not make them fit us. And that turned out to be one of the hardest challenges at FEMA, was getting people to recognize that it isn't about what is easy for you to administer, it's about the people we serve. And quite honestly, there's a lot of people there that going, thank God somebody's bringing this up, because we've been trying to fight these battles. And in many ways, I was just the disruptive force that got people to do what they've been trying to do, which was, we gotta build our systems around who we serve. This isn't about we get to say yes to everybody, because Congress has some specific constraints on us. We're not designed to make people whole or replace everything in a disaster. We are literally just that first step of the recovery. But that part of that recovery should be done in a way that respects those survivors, provides the least amount of hassle to them, getting to the best answer while preventing and eliminating fraud as efficiently as possible. But the primary bias needs to be speed and accuracy to help people, not exclude people because of the risk of fraud. And that is not set in stone, and it still has work to be done. But that was really my observation of bureaucracies. It's not that people are inherently evil or just obstinate. It's that the system rewards for systems that produce the least risk of fraud, waste, and abuse, that run most efficiently with the least amount of resources, with high volume that have to be scalable across all situations in all 50 states and territories. And when that is your bias for design, and you do that in every program, it becomes what it is. And that to me was, kind of this observation that, well, now what are you going to do about it? And that's when you start to realize you have to be a brute force and going, we can't solve for ourselves. We have to solve for the communities we serve. And I started seeing a whole bunch of symptoms because of that. I can remember, and Richard worked on these, and I worked on them, when we would take our disaster plans. We had all these great disaster plans, and Hurricane Andrew happened. We realized the elderly didn't get done well. People with pets weren't done well. So what do we do to all our disaster plans? We added annexes. We put an annex in there for the elderly, we put an annex in there for pets, we put an annex in there for people with disabilities, we added dogs. When I got to FEMA, they wanted to add kids. Mark Schreiber from Save the Children came in. I was there about a week, and he demanded that I put an annex in there for children. And I'm sitting there like going, look, I was a paramedic, trust me. Gene, we were taught, pediatrics are not small adults, they're different. The systems are built for them, not scaled to them. So I told Mark, look, I get it. Children are not small adults. If you're not building systems around the need of children, particularly children that are vulnerable to disasters, to a lot of things that adults aren't, you're going to fail them. But trust me, I just dawned on me, if you put them in the annex, we're not going to do them any good, because if you're in the annex, you're an afterthought. And I basically went back to my staff and said, I got a question. I bought into this. I've been doing it all my professional career. Why do we write plans that we say are for the communities we live in, and then we put all the hard to do in the annexes? Because you add it up. What's the percentage of population that's considered elderly, 65 or older, of any county outside of St. Pete, and Pinellas County? And actually, Charlotte. Turned out Charlotte's where the grandparents of the people in Pinellas were living. But if you look at the average age, 15, 20%. What's the population of people with kids under 5? 10 to 15? What's the population that has pets? About half or more. What about people with disabilities, both identified and not visible? All of a sudden, there's a hell of a lot more people than the annex or in the basic plan. Who the hell are we planning for? That's how I approached it. That kind of threw my staff for a loop. I said, I don't get it. Why are we writing plans for easy instead of for what's real? Why do we have to put everything in the annex? If we're planning for this in the front, it actually makes more sense. It's more resource efficient. Why do we keep putting them in the annexes? Because emergency managers sit in the basement in the closet of the old DOC in the Alachua County Administration Building and write plans by themselves. When I grew up, you just wrote the plan. None of this about including the community because, hey, you weren't government and you'd have all these demands. And that was the problem. We wrote plans that were easy to write, easy to administer, and absolutely failed our citizens. because bureaucracy solve for what's easy to do. It's a lot harder to bring in community groups and bring in various individuals into a planning process that's going to increase your workload, the time frames, won't always have agreements, you're going to have to force consensus, and it's harder. But if you do that on the front end, and you're inclusive and not exclusive in your planning requirements, what happens when the disaster occurs? You got a lot more buy-in, you have a lot more participation, and if you think the public is really a resource, they have to be a resource when you're planning, not in the aftermath. And you get much better plans. It's harder work. And it means you're going to open yourself up to non-government entities who will actually criticize you. But that process builds plans based upon the communities we live in, not make communities fit our plans. And again, I've been through this enough to start this whole process back to why do we end up doing the things we do? When you look at them and go, this doesn't even make sense, and I'm in the business. But I want to come back to one thing and open up to you. As long as we price risk too cheap, there's no incentive to change behavior. Risk will constantly grow, disasters will get bigger, and you, the taxpayer, will pay. The best way I know to price risk is to tie it back to commercial markets and what investors are going to invest in. And there's a lot of people that hate insurance companies, and I ain't a big fan either. But when you allow the market to price risk, they have historically, over longer periods of time, done a better job than when government's pricing risk, because the inherent bias is, you ever find a politician that wants to tell a constituent no? It's one of the hardest things that you have to do as elected officials, tell people, no, we're not going to do that. Yes, you're going to pay more, because that's the risk. And if you want to build there, you're going to have to build to these codes, because otherwise, you're just producing more risk that everybody else will be paying for. But if we don't make that decision, we're starting to hit tipping points. The cost, but more importantly, the suffering that people go through. Now, you start adding up all the people from Texas, Florida, and now Puerto Rico. You're in the millions of people that they just didn't have power go out or a tree through the roof. They've lost everything. And now they're totally dependent upon FEMA programs to at least start the recovery, and it's going to take a lot more money, because that first $15 billion, they about spent that. That was the first supplemental they got. The next supplemental, they're going to need about that much to continue response, and they're going to probably need to do another Sandy-size appropriation. That was $60 billion. And that is not counted against the budget cap. That's done above and beyond the budget. So this is all borrowing that we're just piling on more debt, because we continue to grow our risk in ways that aren't sustainable. And the answer isn't to do an after-action report and beat up FEMA because you couldn't respond better. The answer is, why are we making disasters so big in the first place? This isn't about we don't build. It's how we build, where we build. And yes, it will take regulations to provide level playing fields. But we can do this. And we have some great opportunities, because we've got some areas of heavy devastation. And if we can get Congress to commit to, don't build it back the way it was. Don't build it back to past events. Build it to future risk. At least those federal investments will have a better chance of surviving the next event and not resulting in you paying twice. Last story. When you're at FEMA long enough to see the same structures get destroyed twice, that's pretty good. First, 2010, Arkansas. School gets hit, flattened by a tornado. It's a middle school. They were self-insured. You paid for it. 2014, I'm back. School got flattened again. You know why you didn't pay? It was 2 weeks from being completed. And the construction company still had insurance on their construction project. But the worst part was, they built it without safe rooms. So this is a school that's been destroyed twice. That one of our recommendations is we build schools with safe rooms for tornadoes, particularly in areas that are very prone, in which I think in Florida we should just get over it and say it ain't tornadoes, but it's damn sure hurricanes. We got to be building safe rooms. And They made the choice that it was too complex and was going to cost too much money. And they got flattened again. Now, in another month, that school would have been open. And schools around there that didn't have safe rooms were able to shelter their kids. But if that school had been open, there'd been fatalities. President Obama, when we were in Moore, Oklahoma, we were at the school where the 9 children were killed, and the wall fell on them and killed them and the teacher. We're talking to search and rescue teams, we're talking to families, we're walking away. President Obama said, we can't do this anymore, we gotta change it. Okay, I go back, my team says, we're building safe rooms in schools. We can't do that. Why not? Well, they have to, A, do a cost-benefit analysis to see if it will be cost-effective. I'm like going, yeah, I got that guy. I'm telling you, we're doing it. You don't understand. That's why most of them don't do it, is because they have to do a cost-benefit analysis, and it's so complex that a lot of them just won't even go through it. And they have to do the cost match on it. Congress did something, and again, I know who did it. Staff on the Hill, a lot of times will get things into legislation that do a lot of great things that people don't pay attention to. But one of the things that got put in the Sante Supplemental and Recovery Improvement Act was a clause in there that said FEMA can build back to best available codes and data, not to the adopted building codes. And since the International Code Council, the ones the state don't want to adopt every 3 years because it's too cumbersome, had developed a code for safe rooms, turns out if your building is substantially damaged or destroyed over 50%, you got to build out the code. Right, Richard? Every time something burns down, they build back, or if they're damaged, they got to build to the current codes. And they always go, is it 49%? Because they don't want to hit 50. Remember those battles? So we just said, hey, if you're substantially damaged or destroyed, that's a code requirement. Just like you got to comply with the American with Disabilities Act or the electrical code. So it's no longer a decision you make. And we started doing that to change outcomes. But again, that school and that school district, the only reason you didn't pay was because it was still under construction. Every other school that got hit in that district, self-insured, you paid for it. So, what do you want to know? And they have a microphone because we're streaming. So, Mike's over here, so if you want to come up to Mike, we are streaming this, which means that all the stuff I've said is now a public record. Will come up at some hearing and will be used against me. And I don't really care. Hey, Rick.
When you were here, the federal government made the change.
I can't hear you.
When you were here, in your previous assignment, the federal government made the change of funding 90% of recovery to 75% of recovery in the START Act. What changes occurred as a result of that, or has it been completely bypassed?
No, it's always been 75-25. You got bumped up for a couple of disasters. The Stafford Act, since Tom Ridge originally wrote it, was at 100%. When they found out that was not smart because that was being abused, they went to 75-25. So the law says, and this hasn't changed, that FEMA will provide no less than 75% of the cost and 25% state and local. However, in our rules, we recognize that if you have extreme events, that cost share can be adjusted to as high as 90-10. And it's based upon per capita impact. So, an example, Sandy or hurricanes that hit for New Jersey and New York, they hit a threshold and went to 90-10. Surrounding states were still at 75%. Louisiana went to 90% on their floods. Other places didn't. Matthew, we were at 25% state and local match. And how states do the match is actually up to them. We provide 75% on the federal side, then it's up to state and governments, local governments to do that. Florida splits it 50-50 with state and local governments. The locals can appeal if they don't have match, which is something we dealt with during the 04 hurricanes. Okeechobee County, DeSoto, some of the smaller poorer counties, they really didn't have a match, and so we waived it for them. You'll hear 100%, and the only time that we did 100% at FEMA was we had an Indian tribe that was so poor they had no match. Otherwise, I'm a Democrat. I don't believe if you got skin in the game, you ought to be playing. So I never did 100%. I never recommended it. I figured if it was bad enough, we would get to 90-10. We'll start out 75-25. But I also know that states make a lot of money off the sales tax revenue. and they'll generate funds to do their match. So I'm pretty fiscally conservative, yet they've been doing 100% on protective measures. And quite honestly, in Puerto Rico, because of the debt situation and the bankruptcy, I don't think you had any options there. But I don't think you need to do it in Texas and Florida. Hell, we got a lot of tax capabilities that we've rolled off the books by cutting taxes. So it ain't like we're broke, we're choosing to be broke. But it ain't like we don't have the ability to come up with the money. We're not a poor state, just poor math sometimes.
Hello. What you said about segmentation and how some agencies are siloed in a way that they're not addressing problems.
And we're not talking about the University of Florida, right? We're just talking about the federal government. Okay, just want to be clear.
No, all the colleges here get along nicely.
Yeah, I've heard that.
But I'm actually with Healthcare Coalition here, North Central Florida Healthcare Coalition. And can you speak to healthcare coalitions and sort of, are they an example of what, or the change that we may need to be moving towards?
What are you calling a healthcare coalition? I think I know, but I want to make sure before.
Yeah, the emergency preparedness where you have EM, public health, EMS, and hospitals cooperating in a way that they talk about common issues and challenges and work together as best as possible to address.
That's just basic emergency management. What do you think that's special?
Basic emergency management.
That's what we should have been doing.
Yeah.
It's not novel. Previously the Healthcare Coalition was trying to address why the hospitals kept going on bypass and why we were having to transport patients past ER because they were quote unquote busy. And at the same time they had mass casualty plans they never implemented. So no, what you're describing is really what the system's supposed to be doing. It's nothing novel. It's what the basic things were. It's just that it's so rarely done, it seems novel. But really, if you took the EMS system, which EMS was actually a pretty interesting thing. It was one of the first times you had to have a system with a lot of different interdependencies that weren't owned by any one entity. To make it work, you had to have a 911 system. Alachua County was one of the first 911 systems in the nation. You had to have dispatch and ambulances and crews to get out there that were trained to operate. You had to have medical control and oversight. You had to have hospitals and emergency rooms ready to accept patients. You had to be able to communicate, particularly when you had patients coming in so hospitals were ready. And that was a system that actually predates my involvement in emergency management, but was probably my best teacher of disasters or like emergencies, medical emergencies. It's a systems approach. The hospitals, as much as they would try to buy out EMS, never would do it because they knew it would cost too much. But the reality was, you had county and cities running the first response. You had the hospitals providing the hospital care, emergency rooms, trauma, and developing trauma capabilities and adding in helicopters for that. You had a separate 911 system. Ours was split and then back in the sheriff's office, but that's run differently than the first responders, differently than the emergency rooms. Yet it all works as a system and a team. And it means that when I grew up, you dialed 911, you got a hearse from the ambulance company, from the funeral company, and the question was, what was the greatest profit margin, getting you to the hospital or to the morgue? So, and that was in 1972. By 1973-74, with some federal grants, we developed 911. We implemented emergency life support, advanced life support, transports. We bought the first vehicles actually designed for patient transport, and we built a system. And so when my grandmother got in a car crash in 75, they could dial 911. The ambulance got there in about 10 minutes. There were more than one ambulance and more than one person, and they were more trained than just having basic first aid. They were able to stabilize her and get her to Shan, where they had already called ahead, and the OR was prepped for a trauma patient coming in. And she probably wouldn't have survived if that car crash was 3 years earlier. That system was built, and it operated in that environment. And that's really how I started realizing disasters operate that way. They require multiple dependencies across agencies that on a day-to-day basis don't normally work together. But in a crisis, they have to work as one team. And sometimes you have a forcing mechanism like emergency medical services because you're doing a lot of that every day. But then you got to build in the surge capacity and what happens when it's a much larger event. But the other thing is, and this is the real lesson of Hurricane Andrew, the state of Florida had more employees in state government for Andrew than we did for the 04 hurricane season. We had actually cut probably about think the rough numbers, about 10–15% of the total workforce has been cut through budget cuts. Yet we responded more effectively. Why? Because we didn't respond as a collection of agencies. One of our Department of Transportation secretary said it best: when you walked into the State Emergency Operations Center, you checked your egos and your logos at the door, and you worked as one team. So agencies on a day-to-day basis that didn't work together on solving problems could come together in that operations center and work as a team. It didn't happen overnight. They were trained, exercised, and practiced. Governor Bush, he got to the point where he started realizing his agency heads weren't showing up for his exercises. And so he had the chief of staff take a role of who wasn't there to send him notes, wanting to know, you probably had a great reason, but can you remind me why you didn't make the exercise? And then I get phone calls from the secretaries going, why didn't you tell me the governor's going to be there? I'm like, why do you think we called it the governor's exercise? But your coalition, the most important thing is you're building the relationships, you're doing it outside of the disaster. You're looking at the things you'll expect to happen, but the real test of the system is the fact you got people to solve the problems nobody thought could happen or have ever anticipated. Too many times people say the important thing is the plan. I'm like, the plan isn't that critical. All the plan really does is document how the team is put together, how it works, and how it operates. The most important part of that plan is the planning, not the document. And the exercise and the training that builds the team so that when it's the Levy County bus with the disability and developmentally developed children gets T-boned by a rock truck, and we now have a mass casualty compounded by the fact we have a big-ass extrication with children who can't communicate. We're not starting from scratch. And that actually happened. But systems that are built and designed for just the day-to-day don't scale up. Systems built for catastrophe can always deal with the day-to-day challenges. And that's one of my observations too, is I call my 7 deadly sins of emergency management, but we tend to plan for what we're capable of, what we experience, and what we're used to handling, and we always think it's going to scale up. Things don't scale up in crisis. You either build big or it fails. That's the real story of Katrina. It's not individuals. It were systems that were built with expectations that we can always handle it to this point. If it's any worse, we'll just pedal faster. And it didn't work.
Why don't we take one more question?
So Houston floods 3 times.
Well, it's more than that.
More
More
than
than just
that,
the
yeah.
500-year floods.
Right, and so they rebuild the same way, the same place. What proactive ideas do you have about dealing with those kinds of problems?
For the highest risk properties, sometimes it's better just to let nature win and buy it out and turn it into greenways. You know, with all the flooding we had here in Gainesville, I walk down, I live between Possum and Hogtown, and those are greenways. Now, if you think about it, that's some prime development for 16th and 8th Avenue, right? I bet a lot of people have said, man, it'd be really great to put in a subdivision here, or now we're doing all the high-rise apartments on 13th Street, trying to be a big city and wiping out all the cool places we used to go to. But that's urban planning. I'm not into that.
How come we haven't done that right now?
Because I took a picture, and the city of Gainesville made a decision that they were going to turn their floodways into greenways and turn them into parks and recreation and prohibit any construction in those floodways. So when the flooding happened, there was only one home in my area that got flooded, and they were a known problem. But everything else was, you got to understand, from Possum to Hogtown Creek, I could hear the trees out there falling over because the water was moving so fast. And no homes, except for this one home, got damaged. Because the city of Gainesville made a decision. It wasn't worth building in areas that were going to flood, and the cost would be so great. And we preserve green space and recreational areas, adding to the intrinsic value of our communities. So one of the strategies, and guess who also thinks buying out's a great idea? Governor Christie in New Jersey. Prior to Sandy, he had several floods from Irene, and he realized it made more sense to buy out and spend more money on the front end and buy homes out of these repetitive house areas and turn it into green space. Have you ever been to Des Moines, Iowa? I went there, it wasn't what I was expecting. I get there and it's like, their downtown is incredibly cool. Why? Because they flooded the Des Moines River so much that they finally bought out the most vulnerable properties, turned it into greenways, parks, bike trails, and now they have a whole different economic engine down there on the river, but far enough away it doesn't flood every time. So buyouts are one strategy, elevation's another. But it needs to be something that before the rebuilding gets going, we make decisions on. Because once people get back in their homes and start making repairs, it's a much harder thing to get them to move. You know, there's some of us that are gypsies, but a lot of us, we are very much rooted in place. And so once we're rooted in our homes and that is our place, it takes a pretty significant forcing mechanism to get you to move. And so the first steps will be those that are worst, most vulnerable, try to buy them out, and you just can't buy out one lot and leave another there. You need to buy out entire neighborhoods and turn it into parks and recreation. Low impact use that provides green space adds values. When it floods, it absorbs and provides more natural drainage. For those we can't, elevate. And if they won't take the elevation of the buyouts, cut them off from flood insurance.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think you know why Craig Fugate is something of a folk hero in the United States.